Hello and welcome to Cosmeteer. My name is Pooks, and it's been a while since I've recorded. Apologies for that. The injury to my back was a little bit more severe than anticipated, but I'm back, and what better way to come back than Cosmeteer? Now, there has been a few updates to this game since I did my Let's Play Ironman stream. But we're not really focusing on those changes today. Instead, what we're doing is a bit of a recap now that some time has passed, just looking over the designs of the ships that I've created during the Let's Play series, as that was one of the requests from a comment for quite some time ago. So we're going to go through them all and talk through my design philosophy, what worked, what didn't, and so it's going to be basically a wrap-up of the Let's Play series. If you're only just getting to the end now, of course, you're going to notice that no time has passed. But I'm hoping to be able to get back to actual streaming relatively soon as well. I'm looking at Diablo 4 coming out next week, and I'm thinking, hey, that looks pretty good. I really want to do it. And on the positive news as well, I've had some computer upgrades. So more RAM, a better CPU, and an upgraded motherboard. So we're in tip-top shape to actually properly stream those sort of games, as opposed to, my computer dying a little bit. So hopefully that upgrade will make a big difference. Now, starting off today, though, I'm going to go through each of the ship classes. You can see them all down here. Some of them were once-off designs and didn't last, or just were later in the series, so they didn't need necessarily changing. Others, as you can see, like the Owl, got lots of different versions of it. I also either lost track of my versions or I don't have a saved copy. So sorry everyone if you're missing a particular design. That's not there. I've misplaced it somehow. Oops. Anyway, starting off, the Velociraptor. Now, the Velociraptor was actually the upgraded version of our starter ship. So this is one of the, I think it's the S-Class that you'll get when you first start. Actually, let's bring up the S-Class here. We should be able to find the starter ships, hopefully. Yep, starter. And we can look at a bit of a difference between the two of them. So, the Model S. Few more guns is the main difference, but one of the first things that I did at the start of the series was swap over the reactor core and the cockpit locations. Why, you might ask? Well, because the reactor core is far more efficient if it's sitting here to get to all the weapons, shields, and everywhere it needs to go that's in use the most, as compared to here. So you really want to be able to cap out the use of your reactors on your starter ships in particular, although that's not a bad design philosophy for all ships. The other things that I've done to the starter ships is obviously put a couple more guns on it, put a little bit of armor spiking, more engines so it goes faster because I put on more mass, as well as add some cargo space at the back. So those are the main changes, and we outgrew the Velociraptor quite quickly, but it was good enough to get us started on the Admiral Ironman difficulty, or a good way to get upgraded. Now, the next ship in class that we started designing that was not a logistics ship was the Owl, which is this guy. So what I had in mind for the Owl was always to make it a tank type ship, and it was also a ship design that I wanted a particular shape with it, right? I wanted to make it into a bird-like ship. So this is kind of where it's meant to be, just kind of sitting on a branch or something. The wings are tucked in. That's what I imagine in my head. Basically, it's a ship that I wanted to really put some function following form, if you will. But it was there as a tank, hence why not much of a damage output. I wanted this thing to grab attention and to hold attention, and it to be the damage soak. And that's the role that Owl filled throughout the entire series, is that it was a damage soak. That was its main purpose for being. So if you watch the series, if you're going about this in reverse order or something, or you've always been wondering why the Owl was a little bit useless, why didn't I design it differently, is because it's there to be a big fat attention grabber. Now, in terms of this particular ship, what I've done is modularize the designs. So I've put an engine model down the back and another engine model down the back. The downside of this approach is you've got no balance thrusting up the top, which is a pain sometimes in terms of rotation, but it's got enough quick thrust to really make up for that given the size of the ship. I've then chucked the hyperdrives in the center. We've got our cockpits. I'm not sure. There's probably some kind of crew management issue here, which is why we're not getting power there. I've got our couple of shields to stop the incoming damage. I've got everyone sitting up there. And then I've probably, if I remember correctly, assigned everyone to be at the right place as well. So our power management issue will be, yeah, that was our issue there. So this side is assigned to this side to only power this side only assigned to this power. Something that if you're getting started, I highly recommend that you pay attention to is where your crew are going to and what they're actually doing. As well as, so these guys are all at the back, but if I had them running power, they'd have to run through all this, right? Instead, they're going up and operating the guns and they just sit there permanently. Likewise with our two cockpit guys. Then they get rest, their shields and power, basically. Now the downside with this was again DPS. These are just disruptors. They had limited use given the enemies I was facing at the start. I wasn't really facing off many shield ships. And I felt that OWL was punching below its weight to some extent. So the next iteration of this was, I think I was getting projectiles was a real problem here. So the first thing I did was upgrade its shielding because we were getting blown through the middle here, as well as dropped in some more point defense systems to try and stop those incoming missiles a little bit. So yeah, there's a clear and very distinct difference between the two. I also believe upgraded the reactor cores, so we had a little bit more power coming through each time a trip was made. Because a crew was a limiting factor here. So any way that I could make them more efficient was a good thing. Moving on, and it becomes the biggest jump in design. Now, so we spread his wings, basically. Again, we're going with form over function here again. Really, you could probably find better, more efficient ways to design your ships, 100%. But I wanted to make something in the shape of a bird. So, So we brought out the wings mainly so it would cover a greater area. This didn't 100% work, and I'll talk about that a little bit. I've moved out my disruptors to the side here. I added some additional DPS in the form of missile launchers as well, so it could actually start outputting some damage itself. I believe it had some escorts by this stage. I mean, it always did. I think the velocity stuck around for a bit. We put some more PD cannons up the top as well, and you can see that we've gone for a highly armored approach here as well. So even when the shields fail, we've got armor backing it up, then the shields come back online. These guys are quite close, so they can bring everything back online. We switched from a 2-cockpit approach to a full control room instead. And again, this design, its biggest flaw, if you were just taking it out of context, is limited crew. It could use some more crew to do stuff, particularly in the point defense department. These guys we can't keep energy going to them fast enough from memory. Still with the engine clusters down the back, and you can see we've also added some point defense down just underneath the wings here, because missiles curving around and smacking into the engines and really causing a problem with its maneuverability and its ability to pivot was a problem. So much so that we moved on to the next version of the OWL, where we swept the wings back so we could actually take some of those hits. Instead of sneaking around the side, they would hit on the armor here. That was actually effective. I also added some engine clusters to those wings because its ability to pivot was a problem, and that became a real problem later on as well. But you could say that this is, this was the most Imperium of Man approved version, and then we grew out of that. I also failed to keep up with the paint job as well. It just inherited it from the previous one, so I put a lot of effort here, and then I decided it was just too much work in addition to putting out videos. Not to mention, no one wanted to watch me stream and paint. It was, like me basically playing with Microsoft Paint. Anyway, so we moved the missiles out here. We crewed those missiles better, so we had a better damage output for them, which was great. Engine clusters came into play, a bit more shielding on the sides. I played around with just using a power capacitor up the top here to fuel these, which was reasonably successful and kind of kept these guys in their shielded areas. The other part of the change in design philosophy is 2 crew members per shield dedicated, so there wouldn't be too much running around. So if we go back to this one, then these guys, you know, they might go to this one, then they might run across to this one, then they might run across to this one, and then they might take a trip up here. It was highly inefficient. So what I was looking to do here is make these very efficient in terms of what are they going to do and where are they going to go. So these guys prioritized to fill up these. As soon as it ran out of power, then they had to run back and grab some more cores to top up the power capacitor. Until that time though, then they were basically running around just keeping these active as much as possible. These guys only had to run between these 2 points. These guys ran out, grabbed, back and forth. These guys ran out, back and forth. So as efficient as possible was the idea here. Likewise, I tried to continue this design philosophy, but it got a little bit more complicated here, where this is on this is on this. I think these guys doing. I think they were shooty shoots. Yeah. These guys are powering weapons, so 1 per weapon. These guys, where were you? They're on this shield. These guys on this shield. It kind of worked. What worked with the owl when tanking was pivoting. So we'd have a beam coming in and it'd be bearing through. But if you pivot the ship, so just do a rotate, it actually worked quite well to divert the shots and put it onto a section of shielding or armor that wasn't getting messed up. So pivoting a ship, just being aware that that's a possible tactic, it's quite useful. Next up, we went to the OWL Mark 6, and I think the Mark 6 was just an improvement in terms of, between the 5 and the 6, sorry, was an improvement in terms of those efficiency issues that it had. Might have been hyperdrive. Yeah, actually, sorry. See here, we don't have the hyperdrive. Here, we have the hyperdrive. I think I didn't have enough hyperdrives to actually jump, so we had to make a bit of an upgrade there. Then next came the Battle Owl. So what I worked out was that threat, or who the AI will attack, bear in mind human players are going to react very differently, but who the AI would attack would be based on the potential damage output of the ship. Not the actual damage output, the potential of it. So I've realized that the OWL needed an upgrade because it kept on going for things like the Kestrel or that sort of thing. So instead, we went for the Battle Owl. And the Battle Owl kept the shape, except for kind of reversed it. So if we were to just fling it around, we'll do that. Then it's still kind of the same shape, right? It's got a very tucked in head, is what I will say. But again, we were just trying to retain that shape, and yeah, you guys are just going to be... This is part of the problem with the OWL series, is that it just got caught in everything. Anyway. You know what? You just run off. You just run off, see? Classic OWL. Classic. Always causing a problem like that. Anyway. So we changed design philosophy a fair bit here. We kept the back of the missiles being able to curve around. We added some EMP as well, which was quite effective because we were starting to come up against shielded enemies, and I've gotten rid of those disruptors. Next, I went with the shield neck instead. So big chunk of armor to be able to bury through this, as well as some backup shielding in case they burn through, but we had some kind of regenerative sort of properties here. But the shield neck in particular meant that this area here, probably the weakest point of it, has actually got 3 large shields plus 3 small shields to burn through to actually get into this really vulnerable section of it. And because it's pivoted like this, it means it can project the shield out while still being buried behind all this massive armor. So it's a use of horizontal shielding, if you will. Next up, we chucked an engine cluster up here. We had a couple more clusters here, an engine cluster over here. Again, running shielding. This was not as effective as I would like. The real weak point was actually this little bit here as well. And I think I may have played around with this to try and improve the situation after having a wing blown off and then it coring the whole damn thing. So a chain reaction here, I think, would actually chain react and potentially blow through all through this area. All the ammo factories would blow up, all the ammo would blow up, and we were left with a real problem on our hands. So better armoring between the sections was absolutely needed. But this was a PD battery, basically trying to stop anything from coming in as much as possible. We still had issues with missiles curving around the side because we've really lacked the PD, especially at the back here as well. So that's probably a design flaw that should have been addressed or something done with it. But also the large deck cannons help with the DPS, and the owl became a threat magnet again. So it started taking those damage a whole heap. It could actually survive a fairly good nuke barrage as well. It could survive for quite some time a reasonable laser beam as well, depending on where the AI determined to target. And of course, we still had the pivot option to be able to move the damage to less damaged sections. However, a lot of the time the ships would try to go flank off to the side and shoot through these engine clusters here and cause real problems for it. So we finally came to the final owl, the Owl Mark 8. So basically this meant for a fatter front here. So we can see we've got a bit of a difference on how we approach that. We ended up putting just a small shield here to discourage the casual shot, as it were. And we made a few differences in terms of just making this more efficient. So I worked out that large reactors were less efficient in this situation than medium reactor cores. So it was actually better to have a mid here instead. We also disconnected these two parts as well, put some armor in between it. It was a bit of a trade-off between armor and mass here as well, if you're wondering why there's a difference. That helped with, even if this section was compromised, the next would still have a little bit of stuff that they would need to burn through before they get into the next vulnerable core. You can also see I armored up between these sections, so even if we lost an entire wing, it wouldn't core through and blow up the whole damn thing. And that's obviously mirrored on the right-hand side here as well. I also tried horizontal flaks. I did a video on this, actually experimenting properly with it. But at the time, I was having nuke barrages really targeting this weak spot here. This wing could have been moved in somehow, maybe to make it all just a little bit more compact and therefore less vulnerable. But I was hoping that the horizontal flaks would take out a few nukes before they got in here. Spoilers, they don't. There's a whole video on it, but in terms of testing it and how well flaks do, but ultimately it was a bust. But again, Owl served its purpose. It was a huge threat magnet. It could tank things reasonably well in the end, and it served its purpose, is what I will say. DPS output, absolutely horrible. Not the worst, but certainly for a ship of this expense as well, if you're going for an offensive ship, you'd go elsewhere. Moving on to probably the best ship that we had. And it was, of course, the Kestrel series. The Kestrel and the Comets later. I did put a Comets here. It's on the far right here, just to make sure that they're both included. But the Kestrel started off as one of our first ships, which was a rail ship. With somewhat phallic proportions, shall we say. But it was a siege ship. It was there to help take down stations. So it had the main core components required to do that. meaning the sensor array in particular, so you could see them far enough out. A ammo cannon factory, so we're not going to run out. We just fill it up with sulfur. And of course, the railgun. Now, I ran with a couple of shields up the front, just to, if it ever did attract attention, then it had some kind of defense without this just getting blown to bits and then coring down the middle. Now, the reason for the armor in particular here was to stop that large reactor, or sorry, that medium reactor, getting blown to bits by the guys. It's not the most efficient design, but again, crew being the limiting factor on the campaign mode, it did the job. It's probably a little bit heavy. I think in hindsight, I should have just removed the armor, gone bare naked, and let it just use these reverse thrust and a lightweight mass to really show its worth. And then with enough just little point defense systems, it probably would have been okay against missile launchers. But you live and learn. Moving on to the Kestrel Mark II, I didn't actually learn my lesson early enough there. So instead, I actually increased the mass. This, in my opinion, was a mistake. It did help at the time. A couple of circumstances, I was able to pivot the Kestrel, again, that pivot trick, and take a little bit of damage on the sides. And then when the rail was ready to go again, I could just pivot back. It would shoot, and then I would take it on the other side. But again, I think there was better ways to do it. And in terms of the bit out the back, someone commented, hey, it looks a bit like a sword if you put a handle on it. It's like, okay, we'll put the most lightweight stuff we can on the back of it. But the main upgrade between them, apart from mass, obviously, was this the length of the rail cannon as well, getting to a larger length. Next up, the Kestrel Mark III. Well, it's pretty obvious, right? Double rails was the big thing. And then starting to put the supply of the battery for the rails nested in these little reactors all through the core here. Now, these guys couldn't actually keep up with the firing rate, but it would help for a while. It would keep up for a while, and then it'd peter out, basically. I also moved some crew up here in terms of powering the defenses, so that we wouldn't have such a long trip for the people down the back, and keep these up a little bit more. Didn't really work the best. Yeah. Again, losing mass was probably the better option here, rather than going for improved defenses on it. Keeping out of the enemy's range and then some point defense to keep those missiles away was probably a better option. But again, you live and learn. The Kestrel Mark V. The Kestrel Mark V was basically adding some thrusters here because I was finding that the pivot on this thing was annoyingly slow, whereas this could pivot a lot better just because of those counter thrust. That was the main upgrade. And then I took a very much redesigned philosophy here. We upgraded the rails, but then I decided, hey, we're going to add some massive thrust potential to this thing, and we're going to lightly armor it. We've still got those defenses up the front, but instead we've gone with large shields instead, so it can take a bit of a hit, but ideally it's just getting out of the way instead. So it's just backing up and pivoting as it does so, and doing a bit of a shot. So that was its main defense. We did have a Kestrel Mark VI blow up at some point, I think. You can also see that I shortened the amount of guys that would be running these rails as well. And engine clusters, separated engine clusters was some of the big things. It worked out pretty well. We did do an upgrade, I believe. I honestly can't remember off the top of my head what the upgrade was. Oh no, sorry, this is a Comets versus a Kestrel. There was a Mark 4, 3? Yeah, we missed the 3 here, so sorry that we've skipped one. But this was the final design of the ship. It worked well. This kept it from just being cored by a few errant missiles and that sort of thing. I felt that that was well worth it for the extra mass. These guys kept some of those missiles away, but otherwise, really good ships. Probably could have gone through the series with a fleet of these things and won without too much issue. Okay, so next up is my first, I think it was my first failure. Just gonna have a quick glance. Yeah, it was my first failure. The Wilson. So if you know anything about how ion beam prisms work, this is a fail. Don't set it up like this. This is a bad idea. So the idea with the armor set was, hey, maybe with area effect, things like nukes, because I knew I was coming up on them, this would work like ablative armor. So they'd blow up the island, but the next thing would be free. Yeah, it didn't really work. And then it would point head on and do a big beam was the idea. Again, problems there because it couldn't actually keep series with it. Like if it wants to go to the left here, it's shooting out the right, but it's also shooting out the left to try and stabilize itself and head on target. It was just not great. So after some people pointed out the big issue with the loss of damage on the ion beams, I facepalmed a little bit, and then we did a complete redesign on the Wilson. So we got to the Mark II version. Now the Mark II version was again problematic just because of these ion beams in that it had a very limited range. This thing would need to get in real close to be able to do any damage. So I decided, okay, not working. We're going to do another redesign, and we finally settled on the Wilson Mark III. Now, I added some shielding because I couldn't rely on this armor core to keep the core of it safe. So instead I thought, okay, let's go large shield generators. We'll run the ion cannons and we'll just run those central ones. Its job was to get up behind an enemy and basically rotate around and get in behind and use the beams to drill through. It did its job fairly well. There were a couple of instances where the Wilson worked out. It was a bit of a glass cannon. It could not take a hit whatsoever. Too vulnerable to being cored. But ultimately, I'm not unhappy with the ship, especially given the price. The hardest thing was with the Wilson was when I introduced it, it was a real threat magnet because it does so much potential DPS with those ion beams, particularly this version of it. And then the hour was being overlooked for the Wilson, and I couldn't work out why. And I eventually worked out that it was the DPS potential of the ship that was grabbing all the attention. So once that was solved and the hour was a threat magnet, the Wilson fell in line. Next up was the Trodoc. Now the Trodoc was my first logistics ships, basically a mining vessel, and where we would store all our goodies. You could see at the time when I saved it, I must have had all this stuff. It was okay. It's a mining ship. You don't need too much. You just need a lot of storage, a reasonable amount of thrust so it can get around. I added thrusters up here as well because otherwise when it was mining and trying to get in close to the asteroids, it would be a bit of a pain if I didn't do that. But ultimately, yeah, mining factory ship. It then upgraded to the Trodoc Mark I. It probably should have been called Mark II. Hang on. Which is which? Looking very same-ish. Maybe it's just the probably the point where I saved it. Who knows? Unfortunately, the Trodoc did blow up. So ultimately what I ended up doing is grabbing the one of the NPC ships and expanding it out. And that formed the core of the lifeboat. And then I added some factories and whatnot in the middle. And that was our main type of logistics ship for the rest of the playthrough. In fact, we ended up with 2 of these bad boys. Not fully crewed most of the time. Usually they would be carrying excess crew if they could have it. Otherwise, I would gut them to be able to fill up my combat vessels. Now, at one point we did try some mining and I put this one together. unfortunately, it suffered from stability issues. So because it would wobble in the sun and just pivot real quick, it would have issues while it was going around. Then the sun would kind of start clipping the edges here, and that would cause real bad problems. And then as soon as, you had enough of a bad problem, then the engines would go out. It would start disappearing. And yeah, sun mining was not a good experience for us, shall we say. There's better sun miners out there. I'd encourage you not to use this one. But hey, if you want a lesson in humility, then yeah, go for this one, guys. Next up, the Border Collie. Now, I thought maybe colliers were like a resupply ship. Turns out they were like a coal ship back in the day. So that's why I went for the collier. Therefore, the Border Collie, because it's a terrible pun. Anyway, this ship was all about just carrying spare missiles, mainly for the owl. So the owl would run out, I'd need more missiles, and the Border Collie would be there to go off and mine those and manufacture more. That's all it's here for. Missile supply. It had a few point defense, so it could help out in fights and fight against incoming missiles. No one would really target because it doesn't have much potential damage. And so it could be there as a support ship as well. But by and large, it was just there for missile supply. Next up, now I'm actually going to do this in other. We're going to skip the Pancake and the Random Porter and talk about the Anthony and the Brunton. This was a ship design that I actually found online. I can't remember now who designed it. I'm very sorry for the person who did so. I did explicitly mention it in my video when I first introduced these. These are not my ship design, just to be clear. So the Anthony here was a point defense kind of corvette or boat, or basically it's an escort vessel to the Owl to provide a little bit more point defense against incoming missiles and try and defend those flanks. It's got a shield just to stop random hits coming in, a little bit of armor to make sure that the engines blow up, and that's about it. Now, the Brunton was the alternative version of it, so you can see that the shields are placed on different sides, depending on what side of the ship of the Owl that they were on. So they would sit off the wings and just provide extra PD to increase the survivability of the Owl. I thought they worked quite well. They took a few hits where otherwise the Owl would have or another ship would have. So I think escort vessels are reasonably okay. I thought that the best use of these as well was actually running them in close to the enemy ship about where they launch off their missiles, where it was most vulnerable. And then the point defense would actually have the best impact there rather than sitting back with the Owl and fouling up the Owl's firing lanes. Of course, when you're using them like that, then it would also foul up the firing lanes of, say, the Wilson or the Kestrel or the Comets as well. So it was a bit of a trade-off. I also tried a version of these where they would sit with a nuke up the back, as well as mine layer versions. It didn't work, to be honest. You need a barrage for nukes. These, doing the flip, we would sacrifice the point defense, we'd flip, try the nuke, and it would do bugger all. So if you had a long fleet of these, maybe, if you had a lot of them, potentially, at which point, though, why wouldn't you just build a nuke ship? So, yeah. A worthy try, but ultimately a failure. Just stick with the Corvette thing. It's not worth the extra crew. Now, when I did start encountering those nuke ships, I went for the Pancake and the Porter. The reason for these ships was they can take a couple of nukes up the front. Not a hell of a lot, but a couple, which meant that they were quite useful in terms of sneaking up close to the enemy nuke ships, taking a little bit of the fire on behalf of the main vessels, as well as providing that point defense off the side to try and whittle them down before they actually hit our main ships. Didn't take out a nuke barrage. You don't expect them to do that, but if they can take a couple, then it's, saving your far more expensive ship a lot of hurt and pain. Again, these were in conjunction with the Anthony and Brunton. So these were designed to come up or just to, let's say, that's the enemy vessel and they're shooting downwards then we might sit them there with a slight incline. So if they shoot the border collie, great, it's taken it on the chin. Otherwise, they're shooting past, then we've got the point defense firing on it. If they're shooting around, then the point defense is firing on it. That's the design philosophy, and it seemed to work quite well. Next up, the Ares was an attempted broadside vessel. It might have had a different iteration, I can't remember. But basically, it was designed to just kind of sit off to the side or run around the side of it, shoot in these deck cannons, and make life painful for the enemy. It also had some anti-shield capabilities, because I knew that deck cannons were kind of crappy against shields, but these would take out the shields and then would shoot in the deck cannons. And then the point defense is designed to try and reduce those incoming hits. The Ares didn't last long. I felt that it was not worth it, to be honest. So I end up scrapping the series of it. Potentially other people have done better broadside vessels. I don't know. I haven't observed any. But maybe that'll become a better option in the future as well. Who knows, as Cosmetia gets upgraded. But that was the Ares. It blew up in a blaze of glory on the big wipe that we had. Next up, actually, we'll leave the Dunbar for last. Well, let's go look at the Phoenix. Now, the Phoenix was a bit of a last gasp. Basically, we'd had our wipe, but we had very few materials left, and so the vote was YOLO, right? Put all your resources into a big battleship and see if you can get everything back in one fell swoop. It didn't work. This design, I think the diagonal design didn't work very well. Ultimately, it just failed to do the damage output and the tanking necessary to really go well. They'd shoot through here, and then everything fell to pieces from there. So, pretty looking ship. Looks like it should work in theory. I thought it might work in theory. I think this is pre-Wilson as well, before I knew exact rules around iron things as well. So this may not be the best setup, just heads up. But yeah, not a great ship. But hey, that's what happens when you've got trial and error. And then finally, the Dunbar Dreadnought. The Dunbar here is an anti-nuke ship that has a lot of nukes. It may sound strange, but that's what it is. So the reason for this is for that gap between armor helps with those incoming nukes, because you're not wasting the area of effect damage on more armor. You've got lighter materials instead. So that's why there's gap. Absolutely horrible against beam weapons though. So it makes a real vulnerability if you ever use this sort of layout or layer. PD up the sides here as well to stop anything coming around the side as much as possible. A lot of PD down here. It worked fairly well. These things often got blown up and had to be replaced, but ultimately it was fairly cheap. Big hammerhead to take a lot of damage up the front, essentially. The nukes, these are actually fairly well placed in terms of shooting out those nukes and not hitting at everything. So if I tell it to, can I tell you to force fire? Yeah, so it's going to come out like that and do that. We did hit ourselves a little bit, but not too bad. In most cases, let's say we shoot it out here. And as you can tell, ruinous damage. This thing gets off some hits and it's game over for the other party. Still not the best. A little bit slow, maybe. It often wasn't brought to action because it just took too long to get this much mass into the fight. We did have a blow up of one side of this event at some point, I think, as well. But overall, it could replenish its nukes. It took a little bit of time. It wasn't really designed to be sustained fire or something. But if we take it out and just let's bring it up against the owl, shall we? I'd say it did an okay job. Maybe not the most amazing, but an okay job. that's that poor rotation from the owl. Grab this, tell it to fire on the center here. And I think I need to just get in range. That will help. There's those nukes coming out. And there's the benefit of a nuke ship, is that it will cause absolute chaos. And there we are, they've got our cord. Nuke ships are the bane against big ships like this. You've got to really just dodge them. But, pretty good ship. Gave us a good alpha strike. And definitely paid for itself a couple of times. And that's the ships. That's the roundup. That's it. So I will be doing more episodes of Cosmeteer once there's been some further updates, I think. I'm just waiting on patch developments, basically. There's been a few, but they've been largely performance or cosmetic related. The biggest one was, I think, the introduction of hyperdrive beacons, which will be kind of interesting to play around with to see if we could use that to as a tactical sort of thing. That's what it's meant to be. Or it's potentially just, your ability to create your own station, essentially. But I'll leave that for the future. And thanks everyone for watching. You can look forward to me starting some streams again, hopefully relatively soon, probably in the next week when Diablo 4 comes out. My name is Pooks. Thank you so much again for watching, and for everyone who continue to remain subscribed when I wasn't posting any videos. I really appreciate it. As I said, I had an injury, but we're largely over it. Not 100%, but winging, scapular, and neck problems are largely behind us, and we will have some more content coming out for you soon. Thanks again, and I'll see you in the next episode. Bye now.